Okay, we're going to continue on with the finishing of the gun stock that we started in the previous video. And we're going to demonstrate the use of bone black. This is a product that we sell. And we're going to use this product to selectively darken areas of the stock to simulate a little wear, a little age to the surface, and it adds a lot of interest to the gun as well, rather than have a more uniform color in the stain and finish. So this, like I mentioned, this is bone black. It's a very finely ground powder. So we're gonna, here's what it looks like. So we're gonna incorporate this with some finish. So in order to do that, I'm going to take a brush. This is just a 1-inch paint brush that I use a lot. And I'm going to take a little of the oil that we used previously, and I'm going to dampen this brush just a very little bit. I don't want it to be really all that wet with oil, but just damp with oil. Maybe a tiny bit more. I'm just patting it to try to get it about the right amount of oil. Now I'm going to take you could use about anything. This is a little scrap piece of metal. I'm going to put a little bit of the bone black on the scrap metal. And I'm going to try to work around the... Okay, and I'm a little dry now because it's not really mixing well with the powder, so I'm going to get a little more oil on the brush. You don't want to be too wet, or it just ends up making a greasy mess. That's a little wet. I don't know if you can kind of see there how it's a little wet. And if it's a little wet, you can just add a little more powder too then. You can also tap it to dry a little bit on your rag. Okay, so that's a decent starting point. And like I mentioned, I believe in the previous video, it's good to let the first coat of finish dry pretty well before going about this process. I'm kind of pushing things a little bit, but I generally like to wait until the first coat is dried a couple days, a day or two before doing the bone black. And I'm just looking at my brush and it seems a little greasy, a little dry, so I'm trying to pat it a little bit, or excuse me, a little bit wet, so I'm trying to pat it dry a little bit and come back, get a little more of the oil pigment, put a little more pigment on here. If it's too wet, it just doesn't work. And too dry, of course, it won't work either. That's looking a little bit better. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just hold the brush down like this and kind of work in some areas. Now that's it's a little too wet, not enough pigment. So I'm going to go back and get some more pigment on here. I want it to be rich, strong with pigment. Try that. A little more pigment here. If it's too wet, it just kind of, I don't know, it doesn't really do the job. Try that here. Okay, so I'm just going to work it around like this. Still a little wet. And you can see though how it's darkening areas. So the idea is to kind of darken the areas that you'd expect to be darker, such as around the comb here. A little bit more pigment. Maybe underneath the cheek piece. I don't expect to get all the color I want in one application, but you can get a start. Sometimes up around the lock panels are darkened quite a bit. It's a little easier if the side plate is in place, but we'll do okay without it here. This really looks good around carving as well. It helps the carving pop and stand out from the background. So I'm going to do a little bit more here. So this is relatively subtle to start with here. I could use a little bit of more bone black and probably darken it up a little bit more if I want. Black. Okay, so that's a pretty good start. Pretty good first coat. And as I mentioned, we can keep layering this up and get a little more in subsequent applications, and that's how it looks best if you don't try to get it all in one go. Okay, so that's a pretty good start. Now we'll take a rag too, and you can carefully kind of wipe off some areas that you don't want it to be. Now that with this wood not being sealed real well, this is a little bit harder, but you can come back even with some steel wool and work off some of these areas, or Scotch-Brite synthetic steel wool. So it's a start there. So if you had areas that you got it on that you don't want it to be, you can do it when it's wet, but oftentimes it's a little better when it dries. But you can take a corner, some Scotch-Brite, and highlight areas. And these are usually high areas that receive the most wear. So that basically is the process. So what I would do now is I would let this stock dry, and then what often works well is to alternate between coats where you darken areas and just a plain coat of finish. That helps kind of lock in the darkening. Early on you could get away with just doing multiple coats of the darkening and then without alternating, but as you get more finish, it doesn't have as much to bite into the darkening, so it works well to put a little bit of the darkening on the stock and then use a coat of finish, and it helps lock it in. And then go back to your darkening once again. And as you get more finish, there can be a tendency too where your finish can tend to lift off your darkening from the previous coats, especially the finishes that have solvents with them. So you have to be gentle in applying the finish. Don't rub it a lot, because if it has solvents, it can attack the previous coats, and you can rub off what you've already applied. Or you can use a finish that doesn't have a lot of solvents with it. So, and one final thing I might do, depending on the look you want, is just take a soft brush and you can just kind of blend it a little bit. So that's one way to achieve a bit of an aged look. It's not highly noticeable now, but as you do this process for maybe, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 more times, it'll become much more noticeable, much more apparent. Although we're getting color up around here, I see, and a good bit in here. And it just adds interest to the gun and gives it a little more of an appealing look. And there's other products you can use for this process, but I found the bone black works pretty well. Okay, so that's all for now until the next video.
Okay.
So in looking at the stock, I'm not sure how apparent the darkening was on video, so I opted to add a little more bone black to the brush. So I just sprinkled out a little more bone black on the piece of scrap metal, and I'll work a little bit more in here. And I think with a richer amount of pigment, you can definitely see the darkening effect a little bit more. Now, this doesn't have to be accomplished in one coat, but it's probably not best, but you can see how it's a little more apparent right now. It's good to study original work, and you can kind of see what areas tend to be darkened more than other areas. And the biggest thing with all this stuff is to experiment and play with it. And you'll develop your own ways of doing things, your own techniques, and your own style. There's lots of different methods that work well. This just happens to be one that I use. And this isn't the only method I use. This is just one of them that I use in finishing a gun stock. So, okay, I think that'll be it for now.